20 times. 20 times, Wren's application had been returned with a blunt rejection over the course of 18 months. Why? Because she was too brilliant and too honest. In the city of Chicago, integrity was a death sentence, turning her into an outcast. But she never imagined that this very sentence would become the only thing binding her to a ruthless mafia boss, a man who had also been cast aside by his own family simply because he dared to speak the truth. This is the story of two people who carried the same bleeding wound, rejected for having the courage to live truthfully. Before you step into the lair of Chicago's most powerful man alongside Wren, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. And now, we hope you enjoy the story. Wren Halloran, 27 years old, was now facing the consequences of those 20 rejections. Inside a dilapidated apartment on Chicago's South Side, where the winter wind shrieked through every crack in the windows and snow lay white and heavy across the sill, she remained awake until 2 o'clock in the morning. Her gray-green eyes were dark with exhaustion after 3 consecutive sleepless nights, fixed intently on the stack of freelance auditing records before her. Not far away, her blind grandmother slept fitfully in an old rocking chair. Wren was honest. Wren was brilliant. No one could deny her talent, and yet she was now forced to scrape by on one poorly paid temporary contract after another, struggling to preserve the last home she and her grandmother had left. Tragically, the very integrity that had once allowed her to hold her head high had transformed her into a ticking time bomb, whom the entire financial world had chosen to shun. But Wren had no idea that the streams of money she was quietly unraveling that night weren't merely numbers. They were leading her straight to the threshold of an underground empire, a place where simply knowing too much was enough to make a human being vanish from the face of the earth forever. The man behind that empire was Dario Falcone, 34 years old, the dark crime lord who ruled the entire North Side. He was a ghost feared by all of Chicago, a man so powerful that no one dared to look him directly in the eyes. But beneath that perfectly tailored suit lay a rotting past. Dario had once been betrayed by his own blood, framed and cast down into the deepest abyss, all because he dared to speak a truth no one wanted to hear. Standing at the pinnacle of power, Dario had learned a lesson written in blood. Family ties never meant loyalty. Surrounded by trusted men who were ready to stab him in the back, he came to understand a chilling paradox. Sometimes, an honest stranger could be trusted 1,000 times more than those who shared his blood. What neither of them could possibly have known was that, when the fateful snowstorm came knocking that night, their destinies would collide in a way no sequence of numbers in the world could ever have predicted. The clock on the wall had passed 2 o'clock in the morning, but Wren Halloran still sat motionless beneath the sickly yellow glow of the old desk lamp, her gray-green eyes fixed on the long columns of numbers running across the screen of a laptop that had grown burning hot after working for 3 nights without rest. Beyond the cracked window, the snowstorm continued to howl without pause, layer upon layer of white snow piling thickly across the sill, as though it meant to bury the entire dilapidated apartment where she and her grandmother had taken refuge, while in the corner of the room, her blind grandmother slept fitfully in an old rocking chair, occasionally stirring as the cold crept through every narrow gap. Wren wouldn't allow herself to rest, because the temporary auditing contract for this unfamiliar chain of companies was due the following morning, and every meager dollar she earned was so precious that she didn't dare let it slip away. She went through the books one final time, her trained eyes passing over each line of expenditure like a seamstress examining every stitch, and it was at that very moment, amid a mass of transactions that appeared harmless, that something made her hand suddenly go still. The same expense appeared over and over again, always the same strangely perfect round number, surfacing with steady regularity from one company to another, moving back and forth between names she'd never heard before, companies with no real offices, no employees, and no trace of any actual business activity beyond the smooth flow of money winding endlessly in circles, like a snake devouring its own tail. Wren frowned as a vague sense of unease rose inside her chest, the kind of instinct only an experienced accountant would recognize. The feeling that behind those neat and orderly numbers, some hidden truth was deliberately trying to remain unseen. She couldn't name it yet, and she couldn't understand its true nature, but the instincts sharpened through years of hardship told her that this wasn't an ordinary accounting error. It was something intricately arranged so that no one would ever notice it. She murmured to herself, wondering why a chain of small, unremarkable companies would need to move such enormous amounts of money through so many layers of intermediaries, and why every route taken by the money had been designed to become so tangled that almost no one would possess enough patience to follow it to the end. Guided by the professional habit that had become part of her very blood, the same habit that had caused 20 companies to cast her aside because she dared to turn over every page of their books, Wren quietly copied the entire audit onto a personal hard drive no larger than the palm of her hand. She carefully tucked it into a concealed compartment inside her purse, acting on an instinct for self-preservation without realizing that one day it would become the only lifeline capable of saving her life. She told herself that she would examine everything again the next morning, when her mind was clearer, and that she would find the missing link. But at that very moment, the exhaustion accumulated over 3 sleepless nights crashed over her like a towering wave, drowning what little willpower she had left. The room swayed before her eyes. The numbers on the screen dissolved into a hazy streak of light, and the roar of the storm outside faded into the distance as though it were echoing from another world. Before she could understand what was happening, her head fell onto the cold surface of the desk, scattering the stack of documents, and her slender body sank into a thick, dreamless darkness. She had no idea that within only a few short hours, the numbers she'd accidentally uncovered on this fateful night of the snowstorm would tear her away from the hidden life she'd always known, and hurl her directly into a world where the truth wasn't a virtue, but a death sentence. When Wren finally drifted back to consciousness, the first thing she became aware of was not the biting cold she had fallen asleep in, but a strange, sterile warmth. And for a few disoriented seconds, she lay perfectly still with her eyes half closed, trying to make sense of the soft hum of a heater and the faint smell of antiseptic that filled the unfamiliar air around her. She was no longer slumped over her own kitchen table beneath that flickering yellow lamp, but lying on a firm, clean cot in a small windowless room whose walls were painted a pale clinical white, a room that looked like a private medical office, yet felt nothing like any clinic she had ever set foot in, for there were no nurses bustling about, no forms to sign, no reassuring ordinariness, only a heavy locked silence and the unsettling sense that she had been carried somewhere far beyond her own choosing. Panic rose in her chest as fragments of the night came flooding back, the endless columns of numbers, the strange looping payments, the small hard drive she had tucked away, and then the sudden crushing exhaustion that had swallowed her whole, and she realized with a jolt that someone must have found her collapsed at that unfamiliar office where she had been auditing, someone who had chosen not to call an ambulance, but to bring her here instead, to this quiet, neutral place that belonged to people she did not know. She sat up too quickly, her head spinning, her gray-green eyes darting toward the door just as it opened without a knock, and a man stepped inside, and from the very first moment she saw him, Wren felt the air in the room grow thin, as though his mere presence had pressed all the warmth out of it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored that it seemed to have been cut from the shadows themselves, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, a faint pale scar tracing the sharp line of his jaw, and his eyes, a cold steel gray, settled on her with the still, patient attention of a man who was used to being feared and had never once needed to raise his voice to command a room. He did not introduce himself. He did not smile. He simply studied her in a silence that stretched taut as a wire about to snap, and Wren, who had spent years learning to read what people tried to hide behind polished exteriors, understood at once that this was not a doctor, not an employer, Not anyone who had brought her here out of kindness, but a man wrapped in a quiet and absolute danger she had no name for. He finally spoke, his voice low and unhurried, asking her how she was feeling with a courtesy that somehow made the question more menacing than any threat. And then, before she could gather herself, he asked the second question, the real one, the one that made her blood run cold, whether she remembered what she had been working on before she lost consciousness. Wren's throat went dry, because in that instant she grasped that her fainting had not been an accident that ended quietly, that the strange, sensitive ledgers she had been unraveling had drawn the attention of someone who ought never to have known her name, and that this man had come in person, at this hour, in the middle of a snowstorm, precisely because a lowly outside auditor had brushed against something she was never meant to touch. She forced her voice to stay level, telling him she was only a temporary contractor reviewing routine accounts, that she had noticed nothing unusual, that she wished only to go home, but even as she spoke she saw the flicker of something knowing in his steel-gray gaze, the quiet recognition of a man who could tell when he was being lied to, and who understood exactly why she was lying. He said nothing for a long moment, letting her nervous words hang in the air, and then he told her, almost gently, that she had nothing to fear if she had truly seen nothing, and that reassurance, delivered so calmly, frightened her more than open cruelty ever could, because Wren realized then that whoever this man was, her life had somehow slipped into his hands during those hours she lay unconscious, and that the honest instinct which had ruined her career had just led her across a threshold from which there might be no turning back. The moment the man's gaze released her, however briefly, Wren seized upon it as her only chance and rose unsteadily to her feet, her hands trembling as she reached for the worn canvas bag someone had set on the chair beside the cot. And she began gathering her belongings with the frantic, clumsy haste of a cornered animal desperate to flee, telling herself that if she could only get out of this suffocating white room and back into the honest cruelty of the snowstorm, she might yet reclaim some fragment of the ordinary life that had been hers only hours before. Her fingers fumbled with the strap, her heartbeat drumming so loudly in her own ears that it drowned out the low hum of the heater, and in her panic, she gripped the bag too carelessly, so that when she swung it toward her shoulder, the old clasp gave way, and the whole thing tipped open, spilling its contents across the polished floor in a scatter of pens and folded papers and receipts, and among them, sliding out and coming to rest face up between her feet and the man's polished shoes, was a small leather notebook worn soft and pale at the edges, from years of handling, fallen open to a page covered in her own cramped and hurried handwriting. Wren lunged for it instinctively, but the man had already bent down with an unhurried economy of motion, and his long fingers closed over the notebook before hers could reach it, and for one agonizing heartbeat she froze, watching him lift it from the floor, praying he would simply hand it back without a glance, telling herself there was no reason a man like him would care about the private scribblings of a stranger. He did intend to return it. She could see that in the way he turned it toward her, holding it out without curiosity, but then his steel-gray eyes dropped to the page almost by accident, and they caught on the title written in bold, trembling letters across the top, a title that read like a wound laid open, "The Reasons I Will Not Disappear," and something in those words made his hand go still. He should have looked away, and Wren watched with mounting dread as he did not, as his gaze moved down the page against every rule of courtesy, reading the numbered lines she had written in the loneliest hours of her life, lines never meant for any human eye but her own, and she wanted to snatch it from him, to scream at him for trespassing on the last private corner of her ruined heart, but her voice failed her entirely, pinned beneath the sheer weight of his presence. He read the first reason, which said that she would not disappear because the truth had cost her everything, and she refused to let that price have been paid for nothing, and he read the second, which said that a person who stopped telling the truth simply to survive was already a kind of ghost. And as his eyes traveled further down that raw and bleeding list, Wren saw something shift almost imperceptibly in the granite of his face, a flicker of something she could not name, as though each honest line were striking a nerve buried so deep he had long forgotten it was there. The man who had walked into that room wrapped in cold and absolute detachment, the man before whom all of Chicago lowered its eyes, stood motionless now with a stranger's notebook in his hands, and Wren, watching him, understood with a strange, dizzy clarity that he was no longer reading the words of an outsider, but seeing something in them that belonged to himself, some old and rotting thing he had buried beneath his perfect suit and his empire of fear. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the snowstorm howling faintly beyond the walls, the little notebook trembling almost imperceptibly in his grip, and though Wren still did not know his name, still did not know that she stood face to face with the most feared man in the city, she felt in her bones that the naked honesty of her own broken words had reached across the vast distance between them and touched something no threat, no bribe, and no power on earth had been able to touch in years, and that this quiet, unbearable recognition had somehow changed everything between them before either of them had understood what was truly happening. Standing there with the worn leather notebook resting in his palm, Dario Falcone felt the carefully constructed cold that had governed him for years crack open along a seam he had believed long since sealed, because the trembling honest words on that page were not the words of a stranger at all, but an echo thrown back at him across more than a decade of silence, the voice of a younger man he had buried so deep that he had almost convinced himself that man had never existed. He read the line about how a person who stopped telling the truth merely to survive was already a kind of ghost, and something turned over slowly in his chest, for he knew better than anyone in Chicago exactly what it meant to become that ghost, having once been a young man who believed that blood meant loyalty and that honesty within his own house would be honored rather than punished. A young man who had stood alone before the elders of his family and spoken a truth that no one wished to hear, only to watch that truth twisted into an accusation against himself, only to be branded a traitor by the very people whose blood ran in his veins, and cast down into the deepest abyss, while the real betrayer smiled and prospered. He remembered, standing motionless in that sterile white room, the taste of that ruin, the years he had spent clawing his way back from the bottom with nothing but rage and a scrap of paper on which he had once written his own reasons not to vanish, and he understood that the woman before him, this exhausted auditor with ink-stained fingers and shadows beneath her gray-green eyes, was standing at the very edge of the same precipice he had once been thrown over, holding fast to the same fragile honesty that had cost him everything, and that if the world had its way, she too would either be crushed for it or forced to trade her soul for survival. A colder, more practical part of his mind reminded him what men in his position did with outsiders who stumbled into sensitive ledgers, for she had seen the looping payments. She had begun to unravel threads that led into the very heart of his empire, and the old iron law of his world was simple and merciless, that a person who knew too much was a person who had to be made to disappear, and any one of the men who served him would have expected him to give that order without a flicker of hesitation. Yet as he looked at her, at the raw courage written into every line of that notebook, Dario found that the order would not come, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize that his reasons were not entirely pure, because a cold strategist still lived inside him, and that strategist had already grasped how rare and how useful she was. An auditor brilliant enough to read the truth hidden in his enemy's numbers, and honest enough that she could never be bought, incorruptible in a world where he was surrounded by trusted men who would sell him the moment the price was right. She was, he realized, precisely the weapon he had been searching for without knowing it. A person from outside the poisoned circle of his own household. A person whose very inability to lie made her the only kind of ally he could ever truly trust. And the irony of it struck him with quiet force, that the honesty which had made her worthless to the whole financial world had made her invaluable to a man like him. But beneath that calculation lay something he was far less willing to name, a strange and unwelcome tenderness, the recognition that in keeping her alive, he was somehow reaching back toward the clean and uncorrupted man he had been before his own family broke him, as though protecting her honesty might redeem some small fraction of the honesty he had long ago surrendered. And so, Without letting any of this reach his face, Dario closed the notebook with great care, ordered its fallen pages back into place exactly as they had been, so that she would never suspect how deeply her words had reached him, and held it out to her once more. And when she took it from him with shaking hands, he told her, in that same low and unhurried voice, that she would not be going home just yet, because he had a proposition for her, one that would change the course of both their lives in ways that neither of them, in that suspended moment, could yet begin to imagine. Wren clutched the recovered notebook against her chest like a shield, still reeling from the strange intensity of the moment, and she waited with dread for whatever this dangerous stranger meant to demand of her. But the proposition he laid before her was nothing like the threat she had braced herself to hear, for in that same measured and unhurried voice, he told her that he had a private fund, a legitimate one, whose accounts he needed reviewed by someone from entirely outside his usual circle, someone with no ties to anyone he knew, someone whose only loyalty was to the numbers themselves, and that he was prepared to pay her for this work a sum so far beyond anything her freelance contracts had ever offered, that when he named it the figure seemed to hang absurdly in the sterile air between them. He explained that the arrangement would demand absolute discretion, that she was never to speak of the work or of him to anyone, not to a colleague, not to a friend, not even to the blind grandmother who waited for her in that cold apartment, and that in exchange for her silence and her skill, she would be paid enough to lift herself and her grandmother out of the shadows she had been scraping through for 18 long months. Wren listened with her heart pounding, and every hard-won instinct she possessed screamed at her that nothing about this was as clean as he made it sound, that a man who commanded a private clinic and appeared in the dead of night, wrapped in such quiet menace, did not hand strangers small fortunes to audit ordinary accounts. And she found her voice at last and told him, carefully, that she did not think she was the right person for the work, that she preferred to keep to the small honest contracts she already had, and that she wished only to be allowed to go home. He did not press her, he did not raise his voice, or lean closer, or let any shadow of coercion enter his manner. He simply regarded her with those steel-gray eyes for a long moment, and then he said the one thing she was least prepared to hear, that he knew she had been rejected 20 times by companies that feared her honesty, that he knew she was the only auditor in the city who would refuse to look away from a truth buried in the numbers, even when looking away would have been easier and safer and infinitely more profitable, and that he was offering her the one thing no one else in Chicago had been willing to give her, which was to be valued precisely for the integrity that everyone else had punished her for. The words struck her exactly where she was most defenseless, in the raw and aching place where her pride and her poverty and her long humiliation all bled together, because he had named the wound at the center of her life with an accuracy that felt almost like understanding. And for a treacherous instant, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the dizzying pull of being seen, of being wanted for the very thing that had made her an outcast, and she hated how much that single sentence loosened the resolve she had walked in with. She told herself he was manipulating her, that a man like this weaponized every truth he spoke, and yet she could not deny that the truth he had spoken was real, and as she stood there torn between the deep animal warning in her gut and the desperate arithmetic of the unpaid bills piling up on her kitchen table, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a plain, heavy card bearing nothing but a single telephone number, no name, no company, no address, and he placed it in her hand and told her she did not have to decide tonight, that she should go home and rest and think, and that if she chose to accept, she had only to call. She left that place in a daze, carried home through the dying snowstorm by a silent driver she had not asked for, the blank card burning like an ember in her coat pocket, and though every rational part of her mind insisted she should throw it into the first fire she found, and never look back. She caught herself climbing the stairs to her apartment, already turning the offer over and over in her exhausted heart, already feeling the faint and dangerous flicker of hope kindling in a place she had thought long since gone cold, not yet understanding that this small, dangerous spark was the first thread of a snare that had already begun, silently, to close around her. That night Wren did not sleep, and long after the storm had finally exhausted itself, and the city lay buried beneath a hush of new snow, she sat at her kitchen table with the blank card lying before her in the lamplight, turning it over and over between her fingers, as though the answer she needed might be printed on some hidden side of it, torn between every warning her reason could muster and the quiet, desperate arithmetic of survival. She thought of all the reasons to burn the card and forget the man's steel-gray eyes, that there was something wrong beneath the smooth surface of his offer, that money handed over so easily always carried a hidden weight, that a woman who had spent her whole life refusing to look away from dangerous truths should know better than anyone what it meant to walk willingly toward one, and yet each time her resolve hardened she lifted her eyes to the far corner of the room where her grandmother slept, and it was undone again. She looked at the old woman's frail chest rising and falling beneath a threadbare blanket, at the swollen knuckles of hands that had worked themselves ruined so that Wren might have a chance at the education that was supposed to lift them both out of poverty. And she thought of the eviction notice folded inside a drawer she could no longer bring herself to open, of the heat that would be shut off before the month was out, of the humiliating certainty that 20 rejections had already proven no honest door in Chicago would open for her in time. And slowly, painfully, the decision made itself. She told herself that the fund was legitimate, that he had said so, that all she had to do was read numbers and keep silent, that she could take his money and lift her grandmother into warmth and safety and then walk away untouched. And she almost believed it, because a person drowning will reach for any hand extended toward them without pausing to ask whether that hand means to save them or to pull them under. When the pale gray dawn crept at last across the frozen sill, she picked up her phone with a steadiness that surprised her and dialed the single number on the card, and a voice she did not recognize answered on the second ring, unhurried and expectant, as though it had been waiting all night for her call. Within days, she found herself signing an agreement in a quiet office that smelled of leather and old money, and it was there, as she set her name to the papers, that the true shape of what she had agreed to began to reveal itself. For a soft-spoken man she had never seen before slid the contract across the table and, before releasing it, told her in a voice stripped of all menace, and therefore far more chilling than any threat, that she should understand one rule above all others, that in the work she was about to do, she would sometimes see things she had not been sent to see, and that the only way to remain safe was to master a single simple discipline, to know a thing and then to forget it, to let whatever passed before her eyes leave no trace behind. He repeated the phrase gently, almost kindly, that whatever she came to know, she was to forget, and Wren felt the ink dry on her signature with the sudden cold understanding that this was not the language of ordinary business, that legitimate funds did not require their auditors to unremember, and that she had just set her name to something whose real dimensions she could not yet see. She wanted to ask what he meant, to demand plainly what kind of things a person might need to forget, but the words died in her throat beneath the weight of his patient waiting expression, and she understood that to ask would already be to break the rule she had just accepted, and so she said nothing, gathered the copy of the contract they allowed her to keep, and walked out into the biting cold with the money that would save her grandmother now bound inextricably to a silence she did not yet know the price of, feeling with every step that she had crossed some invisible line drawn in the snow behind her, a line that offered no path back to the person she had been the night before. The place they brought her to work was not the sterile little clinic where she had first woken, but a vast and silent building near the north side waterfront, a converted warehouse whose plain brick exterior gave no hint of the wealth and power humming within its walls. And from the moment Wren stepped through its heavy doors, she felt the weight of unseen eyes settle upon her like a physical thing. They gave her a small office of her own, a desk, a locked terminal that granted her access to the accounts of the fund she had been hired to audit, and everything she could reasonably need, and yet nothing about the arrangement felt like ordinary employment. For the men who moved through the corridors spoke in low voices that fell silent whenever she passed, watched her with the flat assessing stares of people trying to decide whether a stranger was a threat, and made no effort to disguise their suspicion of the outsider who had somehow earned a place among them. Wren kept her head down and let the numbers absorb her the way they always had, finding in the clean logic of debits and credits the only refuge available to her, in that atmosphere thick with distrust. But she could not entirely shut out the sense that she had walked into a nest of predators who tolerated her presence only because someone far above them had commanded it, and that their patience with her was a leash that could be shortened at any moment. It was on her third day, as she sat tracing the flow of one account into another, that the door to her small office opened without a knock, and a man stepped inside, whose arrival changed the temperature of the room, a lean and elegantly dressed figure, perhaps in his early 40s, with slicked dark hair and a smile so smooth and ready that it never once reached his cold, calculating eyes, and he introduced himself as Vincent Gallo, with the exaggerated courtesy of a man who wished her to understand that his politeness was a performance and not a kindness. He leaned against the frame of her desk with an easy proprietary air, remarking in a light and pleasant tone that it was so very unusual for the boss to bring an outsider this deep into the family's affairs, that in all his years of loyal service he could not recall a single instance of such trust being extended to a person from beyond their circle, and that he found himself quite curious about what exactly made her so special, and though every word he spoke was wrapped in silk, Wren felt the blade concealed within it, the unmistakable resentment of a man who considered her an intrusion upon territory he regarded as his own. She answered him carefully, telling him only that she had been hired to review the fund's accounts, and nothing more, keeping her voice level and her eyes on her screen. But Vincent did not move away, and instead his gaze drifted with deliberate slowness toward her terminal, toward the columns of data glowing there, and she saw his smile tighten almost imperceptibly as he registered the breadth of the access she had been granted, the fact that this unknown woman could see figures and movements that touched the deepest workings of the fund. Something flickered behind his eyes in that instant. A cold spark of calculation quickly veiled, and he asked her in that same silky voice just how much of the accounts she was able to view, whether her access extended to the older transactions or only the recent ones. And Wren, sensing danger without understanding its source, gave him a vague and modest answer that revealed as little as possible, some instinct warning her that to appear too capable before this man would be to make herself a target. Vincent studied her a moment longer, his smooth smile never wavering, and then he straightened and told her pleasantly that he was sure they would be seeing a great deal of one another, that she should not hesitate to come to him if she ever had questions about the accounts, an offer that felt far more like a claim of ownership than an act of goodwill. And as he turned and left her office, Wren released a breath she had not realized she was holding, unable to shake the certainty that in those few minutes she had made an enemy whose enmity would prove dangerous, and unaware that Vincent Gallo had just walked away, having marked her precisely because of what her eyes were permitted to see. The days that followed drew Wren deeper into the labyrinth of the fund's accounts, and the further she went the more clearly she began to sense that something beneath its polished surface was quietly rotting, for her practiced eye, the same eye that had once cost her every job in Chicago, kept snagging on small irregularities that no honest ledger should contain. Payments issued to contractors for work that left no visible trace, invoices for services rendered by companies that seemed to exist only on paper, sums flowing outward in careful, unremarkable amounts that never quite triggered alarm on their own but which, gathered together across many months, formed a pattern too deliberate to be accident. She worked late into the nights, cross-referencing one shell arrangement against another, tracing the threads back through layer after layer of intermediaries, and slowly the shape of the truth emerged before her with the cold certainty of arithmetic, that someone inside this organization, someone with intimate knowledge of how the fund was structured and the authority to move money without question, had been siphoning wealth out of it steadily and cleverly for a very long time, disguising the theft as legitimate expenditure so skillfully that it had gone unnoticed by everyone above and around them. She could not yet put a name or a face to the traitor, for the fraud had been built with the patient care of a person who understood exactly how audits worked, and exactly what an auditor would look for, but she was certain now that a traitor existed, a hidden hand bleeding the fund from within, and the realization frightened her more than anything she had encountered since she first woke in that white room, because she understood that to know such a thing in a place like this was to hold something lethal. Remembering the soft-spoken man's warning to know a thing and then forget it, Wren said nothing aloud and gave no outward sign of what she had found, but her long-ingrained instinct for self-preservation would not let her simply trust that the discipline of forgetting would keep her safe, and so late one night, working alone in her small office, she quietly copied the most damning threads of evidence onto the same small personal hard drive that had ridden home in her bag that first snowbound night, adding these new findings to the backup she had never mentioned to a living soul, telling herself that a person who had been betrayed by every institution she had ever served would be a fool to leave the only proof of the truth entirely in the hands of others. It was during one of these late nights that Dario found her still at her desk, and rather than the cold, detached figure of their first meeting, he seemed, in the quiet emptiness of the building after hours, somehow more human, and he lingered in the doorway and asked her not about the accounts, but about herself, about the notebook he had read, about what it had cost her to keep telling the truth, when every truth had only brought her ruin. Wren, exhausted and disarmed by the lateness of the hour, found herself answering more honestly than she intended, telling him of the jobs she had lost and the doors that had closed, of the slow humiliation of watching lesser people prosper by looking away from what she could not bring herself to ignore, and as she spoke she saw something move across his hard features, a shadow of recognition so deep and so unguarded that it stopped her mid-sentence. He told her then, in a low voice she had not heard him use before, that he understood better than she could imagine what it was to be punished for honesty by the very people who should have protected her, that he too had once spoken a truth that had cost him everything and everyone he loved. And though he did not name the family that had broken him, nor the abyss into which they had cast him, Wren heard the old grief bleeding through his measured words, and understood that beneath the empire and the fear and the perfectly tailored armor, there lived a man carrying the very same wound she carried. And for one strange suspended moment, the vast distance between the ruthless crime lord and the destitute auditor seemed to close entirely. Two people who had each been cast out for the crime of living truthfully, recognizing in one another a loneliness they had each believed to be entirely their own, neither of them yet realizing how dangerous it was for either of them to be seen so clearly. What neither Wren nor Dario had noticed in that quiet late-night moment of recognition was that they had not been entirely alone, for very little happened within the walls of the Northside headquarters that did not eventually reach the ears of Ignazio Falcone, Dario's uncle, and the most senior of the old guard, a silver-haired man of careful manners and colder calculation who had spent his long life learning to read the smallest shifts in the people around him, and it did not take him long to perceive what his nephew himself had scarcely admitted, that the boss's interest in the outside auditor had begun to stray beyond the strictly practical. Ignazio had watched Dario linger where he need not linger, had noted the softening in a face that showed softness to no one, had seen the way the ruthless man who trusted nobody seemed to lower his guard by some fraction in the presence of this penniless stranger. And to a man of the old guard, this was not a private matter of the heart, but a threat to the entire order of things. For an outsider who held the boss's confidence, an auditor already permitted to see too deeply into the family's affairs, was a crack in the foundation through which everything might one day come tumbling down. He summoned the elders to a quiet gathering in the oak-paneled room where the family's true decisions had always been made, and there, in low, grave voices, they agreed among themselves that the danger had to be contained before it could grow, that Dario had to be bound firmly and publicly to the interests of the family before whatever was stirring in him could pull him off course, and the instrument they chose was the one their world had always favored: a marriage, an alliance that would tie their house to another powerful lineage and remind their wayward boss precisely where his loyalties were meant to lie. It was only after this decision had been reached that Ignazio carried word to the house of Belandi and to its daughter, and thus set in motion the arrival of Vittoria Belandi, so that the sequence was clear and deliberate, the old guard perceiving the threat, resolving upon the marriage, and only then summoning the woman who would serve as its seal. Vittoria came into the headquarters some days later as though she already owned it, a striking woman of perhaps 29, with dark lustrous hair and a beauty polished to a hard bright edge, dressed in clothes that whispered of enormous wealth, and carried herself with the serene arrogance of someone who had never in her life been made to wait for anything she wanted. And from the moment she swept through those doors, the atmosphere of the place bent around her like iron filings around a magnet. She greeted Dario with a proprietary familiarity that made plain she considered the matter of their union already settled, and when her cool dark eyes fell upon Wren, taking in the plain clothes and the ink-stained fingers and the shadows of exhaustion that no amount of talent could disguise, something flickered across her lovely face that was colder than mere indifference. A swift and total assessment followed by an equally swift dismissal, the look of a woman appraising a rival and finding her, on the surface at least, beneath concern. Yet beneath that dismissal, Wren sensed a watchfulness, a sharpness that did not match the careless disdain Vittoria wore so openly, as though the other woman had registered something about her presence that troubled her more than she wished to show, and Wren, who had learned long ago to read the true feeling behind a practiced face, understood at once that this glittering newcomer regarded her not merely as a servant beneath notice, but as an obstacle to be removed. The elders wasted no time, and within days it was announced through the quiet channels of the family that the engagement between Dario Falcone and Vittoria Belandi would be formalized in a matter of weeks, a date set with deliberate haste, and Wren heard the news secondhand in the corridors and felt something tighten unexpectedly in her chest, a sensation she refused to examine too closely, telling herself it was no concern of hers whom the crime lord married, even as she became aware that the ground beneath her had shifted once again, that forces she could not see were rearranging themselves around her, and that the fragile understanding that had passed between her and Dario in the small hours of that quiet night had already made her, in the eyes of the family, something far more dangerous than an auditor. The truth came to her not through any confession but by accident, in the way the most devastating truths so often do, when Wren stayed late once more to finish a difficult reconciliation and wandered down an unfamiliar corridor in search of a working printer, and through a door left carelessly ajar, she overheard fragments of a conversation between two of the men who guarded the building, spoken in the easy, unguarded tones of people who believed no outsider was near, words that referred to Dario not as a fund manager or a businessman, but by another name entirely: the boss, the one who ran the whole North Side, the man whose empire of protection rackets and laundered fortunes and buried enemies stretched across half the city. Wren stood frozen in the dim hallway, with her heart pounding against her ribs, as the pieces she had refused to assemble suddenly locked together into a single unbearable picture: the private clinic that was no clinic, the fortune paid for silence, the warning to know a thing and then forget it, the nest of watchful predators, the fund whose accounts had never quite made sense because they were never meant to be clean, and she understood with a sick, lurching horror that the legitimate enterprise she had told herself she was auditing was nothing of the kind, that she had been drawn into the heart of a criminal empire, that the money now keeping her grandmother warm had been washed of other people's suffering, and that the man who had looked at her with such unbearable understanding in the small hours of the night was the most feared crime lord in Chicago. The betrayal she felt was total and immediate, cutting far deeper than mere fear, because in that late-night moment of shared grief, she had allowed herself to believe, foolishly, dangerously, that he had seen her, that two wounded people had recognized something true in one another, and now that tender recognition curdled into something poisonous, as she realized how thoroughly she had been played. How the very honesty that was her only remaining pride had been identified and targeted and used. How she had been maneuvered step by step into becoming a useful instrument of a man to whom she was surely nothing more than a convenient tool, a pawn positioned on a board, whose true dimensions she had never been permitted to see. She did not wait until morning, could not bear to spend another hour beneath that roof pretending, and she went to find him and found him alone in the upper office, and when he looked up and saw her face, he understood at once that she knew, and she demanded of him, in a voice shaking with equal parts fury and terror, whether it was true, whether he was what those men had called him, whether everything from the very first night had been a careful manipulation designed to bind an incorruptible auditor to a corrupt empire. Dario did not lie to her, did not insult her with denials, and the quiet steadiness with which he acknowledged the truth only deepened her sense of betrayal, and she told him then, her words tumbling out hot and broken, that he had used the one thing she had left, that he had taken her integrity and her desperation and her grandmother's helplessness and turned them all into a leash, that she had trusted the sincerity in his voice when he spoke of shared wounds, and now she saw it for the calculated cruelty it must have been, and through all of it he said almost nothing, absorbing her fury without defense, which somehow made everything worse. She told him she was finished, that she would not launder another number for him, that he could keep his blood money, and his empire, and his silence, and she turned and walked out of that office, and out of that building, into the cold night, half expecting at every step to be stopped, to feel a hand close upon her arm, to discover that a person who knew what she knew would never simply be allowed to leave. But no one stopped her, and she made her way home trembling with adrenaline and grief, and it was only when she reached the safety of her own dim apartment that she remembered the small hard drive still riding in the bottom of her bag. The quiet backup she had never mentioned, now carrying not only the fund's secrets, but the evidence of a hidden traitor bleeding that empire from within, and she understood with a cold prickle of dread that whatever she had told Dario, she had not walked away empty-handed, and that the most dangerous knowledge of all was still in her possession. Wren came home that night with the cold still clinging to her coat, and something broken loose inside her chest, and though she tried to move quietly through the dark apartment, she found her grandmother awake in the old rocking chair, as though the blind woman had somehow sensed across the miles that her granddaughter was in pain. And at the soft sound of Rosaline's voice asking what was wrong, the fragile composure Wren had held together all the way home finally shattered, and she sank to the floor beside the chair and wept as she had not allowed herself to weep in years. She poured it all out in a torrent she could not stop. Not the dangerous particulars that would have put the old woman at risk, but the shape of her despair, that she had let herself hope again, that she had trusted a person who had only been using her, that the one job which was supposed to save them had turned out to be built on lies, that she was tired down to her bones of being punished for the only virtue she had ever possessed, that every single time she dared to believe the world might finally reward her honesty, it turned instead and struck her down for it. Rosaline listened without interrupting, her clouded eyes fixed on nothing, her ruined hands moving slowly through her granddaughter's hair, the way they had when Wren was a child, and she let the girl empty herself of grief before she spoke, and when at last she did speak, her voice carried the weight of 80 years of storms, weathered and survived. She told Wren that she had lived long enough to learn that the world would never simply hand a poor woman the justice she deserved, that the doors which mattered were always the ones held shut against people like them, and that a person could spend her entire life standing politely before those closed doors, waiting for someone kinder or stronger or richer to open them from the other side, and die still waiting. And then the old woman took her granddaughter's face in both her worn hands and said the words that would lodge themselves in Wren's heart and refuse to leave, that when a door is slammed shut in your face, you cannot wait for a man to open it for you, that you must find the strength to break it down yourself, that the only power a person like them would ever truly own was the power they seized with their own two hands. The words fell into the silence of the cold apartment, and settled somewhere deep in Wren, striking against the same stubborn core that had kept her honest through 20 rejections, and for a moment she felt something stir in the wreckage of her spirit. A faint, dangerous ember of defiance. The first suggestion that perhaps she was not merely a victim of forces larger than herself, but a person who still held, somewhere, a weapon of her own. Yet the ember did not catch, not yet, for exhaustion and fear pressed too heavily upon her, and every practical instinct she possessed recoiled from the sheer madness of what defiance would mean, that to fight back against the world she had glimpsed was to invite the very annihilation the soft-spoken man had warned her about. That the safest and most sensible thing she could possibly do was exactly what she had been told to do from the beginning, to know what she knew and then to forget it, to bury the small hard drive somewhere it would never be found, to take whatever remained of the money and disappear into obscurity with her grandmother and never look back. She told herself that this was not cowardice but survival, that she had a blind old woman depending on her, and no right to gamble both their lives on some doomed act of principle, and so she resolved, as she lay sleepless that night, to let it all go. To forget the traitor she had uncovered, and the crime lord who had used her, and the whole terrible glimpse she had been given of the empire beneath the city, not yet understanding that the choice to forget had already been taken out of her hands, and that the danger she hoped to walk away from had already turned, in the shadows, to follow her home. The choice to forget, however, was never truly hers to make, because in the days after she walked out of the Northside headquarters, Wren began to notice the small signs that she was no longer alone. An unfamiliar car parked too long across from her building, a figure who lingered at the far end of her street and was gone whenever she looked twice, the prickling certainty on the back of her neck as she walked home from the corner store that someone was matching her pace at a careful distance, and though she tried to dismiss it as the paranoia of a frightened mind, she knew in her bones that the watching was real. What she could not have known was that Vincent Gallo, the smiling traitor bleeding the fund from within, had grown uneasy the moment she left. For a man who has spent years concealing a theft learns to fear nothing so much as a brilliant, honest auditor who has had unrestricted access to the very accounts he has been falsifying. And Vincent had not survived so long in his dangerous world by trusting that such a person would simply keep silent, and so he had made it his quiet business to learn what she knew and whether she had carried any trace of it out of the building with her. The pressure came not as open violence, but as something colder and more patient, a slow tightening of unseen hands, and it reached its point one gray afternoon when Wren returned to her apartment to find that the small, careful order of her home had been subtly disturbed. Drawers not quite closed the way she had left them, papers shifted, nothing taken and nothing broken, the message unmistakable precisely because it was so restrained, a demonstration that these people could reach into the last safe place she had and touch whatever they wished. Not long after, a man she did not know fell into step beside her on the crowded sidewalk near the market, close enough that she could not simply walk away, and in a pleasant conversational murmur that never rose loud enough for any passerby to notice, he spoke of how fragile a person's situation could become, how a woman with a blind grandmother to protect ought to think very carefully about the company she kept and the things she allowed herself to remember. How much safer life was for people who understood that certain knowledge was best surrendered, rather than kept. And then he wished her a good day, and melted back into the crowd, leaving her standing rigid and cold on the pavement, with her heart slamming against her ribs. Wren understood then, with a clarity that cut through all her exhausted hopes of simply disappearing, that the path of forgetting she had chosen the night before was an illusion, that Vincent Gallo, whoever exactly he was, had already decided she knew too much to be allowed to fade quietly into obscurity, and that whether she stayed silent, or whether she fled, whether she buried the hard drive or destroyed it, she and her grandmother would remain a loose thread that a careful man would eventually feel compelled to cut. To run was to be hunted, and she had no money to run far, and no place in the world where a poor auditor and a blind old woman could vanish beyond the reach of an empire that stretched across the city. And to stay silent was merely to wait, defenseless, for the day someone decided that the safest thing was to make certain she could never speak at all. And as this terrible arithmetic resolved itself in her mind, Wren felt her grandmother's words rise up again from where they had lodged in her heart, that when a door is slammed shut, you cannot wait for someone else to open it, that you must break it down yourself. Now those words met the cold reality of her situation and struck fire at last, for she saw that her only remaining protection, the single thing that might keep both of them alive, was the very knowledge they wished to bury, that the traitor's fraud she alone had uncovered was not a danger to be forgotten, but a weapon to be wielded, that if she could not disappear and could not stay silent, then the only way through was forward, to drag the whole rotten truth into the light before they could bury her with it. The spiritual defiance her grandmother had planted, and the situational terror Vincent had inflicted, converged into a single hard resolve, and Wren, trembling but no longer paralyzed, understood that she would have to do the most dangerous thing imaginable, to stop being the hunted and become the one who exposed the hunter. Now that she had resolved to fight rather than flee, Wren turned upon the copied data with a fierce and sleepless concentration, no longer the reluctant auditor trying to unsee what she had found, but a hunter tracing a quarry through the tangled undergrowth of the numbers, and this time, she followed the threads not merely to confirm that a traitor existed, but to learn everything the money could tell her about who that traitor served and what he ultimately intended. As she cross-referenced the falsified contracts against the wider movements of the fund, a new and startling pattern began to surface, for the sums Vincent had been quietly draining were not simply vanishing into a private hoard as she had first assumed, but were being funneled, through a chain of intermediaries as elaborate as the ones she had first noticed on that snowbound night, toward a destination that made her breath catch, the accounts of the House of Belandi. She dug deeper, pulling at every public filing and financial trace she could reach, and the truth assembled itself before her with the cold inevitability of a proof that the glittering and arrogant Belandi family, whose daughter was to marry Dario in a matter of weeks, was not the powerful lineage it pretended to be at all, but a hollow shell rotting from within, drowning in secret debt, its fortune long since squandered, its grandeur maintained only by a desperate and elaborate performance of wealth it no longer possessed. In that instant, the engagement she had heard about in the corridors revealed its true and cynical shape, for a marriage between a bankrupt house and the powerful Falcone Empire was no alliance of equals, but a rescue disguised as a union, a way for the ruined Belandis to bind themselves to a river of clean and endless money, to borrow the Falcone name and the Falcone protection to conceal their own collapse, and Vittoria's serene certainty that the match was already settled now made a colder kind of sense, for she was not a bride, but a woman fighting for the survival of her entire house, and she would allow nothing and no one to threaten the union upon which everything depended. But the most chilling revelation was the last, for as Wren traced the final threads, she saw that the money Vincent had been siphoning from the fund flowed into the very same Belandi accounts, and the pieces locked together into a single monstrous picture. That Vincent Gallo and Vittoria Belandi were not separate dangers circling Dario from different directions, but secret partners bound together in a common design, the traitor within and the bride without, one draining the empire's blood from inside, while the other prepared to seize it through marriage, both feeding the same ruined house, both working toward the same end. The three dangers Wren had been struggling to understand as separate threats, the hidden thief in the accounts, the forced engagement, and the resentful woman who had marked her as an obstacle, now revealed themselves as three strands of a single rope, a coordinated conspiracy to hollow out Dario Falcone's empire and take it for themselves, and she sat back from the glowing screen with her heart pounding, holding in her hands the proof of a betrayal far vaster than the simple theft she had first uncovered. What Wren did not know, working alone through those desperate nights, was that she was not the only one who had begun to sense the rot, for Dario himself, ever since the fund's numbers had first troubled the edges of his attention, and ever since a brilliant auditor had walked out of his headquarters, carrying secrets he could not retrieve, had grown quietly certain that someone close to him was moving against him, and had set his own patient investigation in motion, watching Vincent with the cold wariness of a man who had already been destroyed once by a traitor within his own house, and had sworn never to be blind to such treachery again. Neither of them yet knew what the other had found, and Wren still believed herself entirely alone against the conspiracy she had uncovered, but the two separate hunts were already curving toward one another through the dark, the outcast auditor with her copied evidence, and the crime lord with his quiet suspicions circling the same hidden enemy from opposite sides, and the moment when those two paths would finally converge was rushing toward them faster than either could have foreseen. Knowing the shape of the conspiracy was not the same as being able to prove it, and Wren understood with the hard clarity of her profession that a suspicion, however certain, was worthless against people this powerful, that to survive she would need to build something no one could deny or dismiss or explain away, an argument written in the one language that could not lie. And so she gathered the last of her strength and threw herself into the most important work of her life. For 3 days and nights she barely slept, barely ate, subsisting on cold coffee and sheer will, while her grandmother slept in the next room, and she spread the copied data across every surface of the small apartment, and began, thread by painstaking thread, to construct the complete and unbreakable case, the very thing that 20 companies had feared she would do to them, turned now upon enemies who truly deserved it. She worked the way only a person of rare gift can work, following each falsified contract from the moment the money left the fund, through every shell company and intermediary account that had been designed to obscure its passage, documenting how each fraudulent invoice had been created and approved, matching the timing and the amounts and the signatures until the pattern that had taken years to hide stood exposed in the pitiless light of arithmetic, and one by one she nailed each transaction to the man who had authorized it, until the hidden hand that had bled the empire from within could no longer be anyone but Vincent Gallo. Then she carried the proof further, tracing those same drained sums across the final threshold into the failing accounts of the House of Belandi, laying bare the secret bankruptcy the family had spent so much to conceal, showing beyond argument that the money stolen from Dario was the very lifeblood keeping the Belandi facade from collapse, and demonstrating in cold sequential detail how the theft and the marriage were two halves of one design, how Vincent's fraud fed the ruined house that Vittoria's union was meant to rescue, how the traitor within and the bride without were bound together in a single coordinated scheme to hollow out the Falcone empire and inherit its wealth. She built it all as a case that would stand before the harshest scrutiny, every claim anchored to a document, every accusation supported by a trail that any competent eye could follow and no clever tongue could talk away. And as the structure of it took shape beneath her exhausted hands, Wren felt something she had not felt in 18 long months of humiliation and rejection, the fierce and steadying return of her own worth, the knowledge that the very brilliance and honesty that had made her an outcast were now the only forces capable of dragging the truth into the light. There was a bitter triumph in it, for every door that had ever been slammed in her face had been slammed precisely because she was the kind of person who could do exactly this, who would follow the numbers wherever they led no matter who they indicted, and now that unforgiving gift had become her single weapon and her only shield, and she was wielding it not as a victim begging to be saved, but as a woman who had chosen, against all sense and all fear, to break down the door herself just as her grandmother had told her she must. She made copies of the completed case, and hid them in more than one place, understanding that the evidence was worthless if it could be destroyed along with her, and she thought long and hard about what to do with it, for she knew that in a world governed by no law she could appeal to, proof alone would not save her, that she could not simply carry it to the police who could be bought, or the courts that could not reach into the shadows where these people lived, and that the only arena in which her truth could strike a decisive blow was the very family whose empire was being stolen, before the assembled power of the Falcones themselves, where exposing Vincent and the Bellandis would set the conspirators against the full weight of the organization they had betrayed. It was a terrifying calculation, to walk back willingly into the lair she had fled and place herself before the most dangerous people in the city, but Wren understood that it was also the only path that led anywhere but to a quiet disappearance. And as she looked down at the finished work of her 3 sleepless days, the complete and damning truth she had assembled with nothing but her own mind and her own stubborn integrity, she knew that she had stopped waiting to be rescued, and that whatever came next, she would meet it as the author of her own fate. But Vincent Gallo had not survived so long in his ruthless world by waiting for danger to announce itself, and the same instincts that had made him fear the honest auditor from the beginning now warned him that she had gone quiet, in exactly the way a person goes quiet when they are building something. And through the eyes and ears he kept everywhere he learned that she had not fled the city as a sensible frightened woman would have done, but had instead gone to ground and begun working with a feverish secrecy, and he understood at once that whatever she was assembling in that cold apartment was the one thing that could destroy him, and he resolved to reach her before she could bring it into the light. He came for the evidence on the very night she had finished it, choosing the late dark hours when the streets were empty, and Wren, who had scarcely slept in days and whose nerves were stretched to their breaking point, heard the careful sounds at her door that told her the waiting was over. And a cold terror flooded through her even as a strange clarity settled over her mind, for she had known this moment might come and had prepared for it as best she could, sending the completed case out to its hidden resting places before ever allowing herself to rest. What followed was not the crude violence of a lesser man, but something quieter and more menacing. Vincent stepping into her small home with his smooth, false smile finally stripped away, speaking in a low, even voice of how much simpler things could have been if she had only learned to forget. How a clever woman should have understood that some truths were fatal to their keepers, and Wren backing away with her heart hammering, keeping the width of the room between them, refusing to give him the location of what he had come to seize, even as he made unmistakably clear that he did not intend to let her leave that apartment carrying what she knew. The confrontation drew taut as a wire on the point of snapping, the old woman thankfully sheltered and unaware in the back room, Wren's mind racing through every desperate calculation as Vincent advanced with the patient certainty of a man who had done such work before. And in that suspended, breathless moment when it seemed there could be no escape, the door gave way a second time, and Dario Falcone was there. He had come because his own patient hunt had finally converged with hers, because the suspicions he had nursed for weeks had hardened into certainty and led him at last to the truth of Vincent's treachery, and because when his watchers reported that Vincent had moved against the auditor in the dead of night, he had understood in a flash exactly what it meant, and had crossed the city faster than he had ever moved for anyone. The reckoning between the two men was swift and grim, a collision of 2 dangerous figures in the cramped space of that shabby apartment, and though it was fierce, it did not become the thing of nightmares, for Dario had come prepared, and Vincent, caught between the woman he had underestimated and the master he had betrayed, found his careful scheme collapsing around him in the space of a few terrible minutes, his bravado draining away as he realized that he was cornered at last. And here was the thing that Wren would remember long afterward, that in the aftermath, when the immediate danger had passed and Vincent was no longer a threat, Dario did not reach for her evidence, did not demand the hard drive or the copies, or ask her to hand over the proof so that he might be the one to wield it, but instead turned to her and made it clear without words that the truth she had built with her own hands remained hers, that he had come to stand beside her and not to take her place, that the decisive weapon in what was coming would be hers to hold and hers to present. It would have been so easy for a man of his power to seize the victory for himself, to make her once again an instrument in someone else's design, and the fact that he did not, that he deliberately left the case in her keeping, and the final blow for her to strike, told Wren more about the man beneath the empire than any confession could have. And standing there in the wreckage of that endless night, exhausted and shaking, and somehow still unbroken, she understood that she had not been rescued at all, that she had saved herself, and merely been joined at the last by someone who understood at last what it meant to let another person keep their own hard-won truth. The reckoning came before the assembled elders of the family, in the same oak-paneled room where Ignacio and the old guard had once decided Dario's fate for him, and it was Dario who summoned them all, the senior men of the house, the wary uncles and cold-eyed lieutenants, and Vincent Gallo held under guard, and Vittoria Belandi brought in with her serene arrogance already beginning to fray at the edges, for she had heard enough to know that something had gone catastrophically wrong. And then, into that room full of the most dangerous people in Chicago, Dario brought Wren, not as his instrument, and not as his shield, but as the one person who could speak the truth that would decide everything, and he stepped back, and let her stand before them, a penniless auditor in her plain clothes, facing an empire's worth of suspicion and hostility, and told them simply that they would want to hear what she had found. Wren's hands trembled as she began, but her voice steadied as it always did when she spoke the language of the numbers, for here at last was the one ground on which she had never in her life been uncertain, and she laid the case before them exactly as she had built it, methodical and merciless, following the stolen money out of the fund through every disguised channel and shell company until each thread led back, undeniably, to the man who had authorized it, until the hidden theft that had bled the empire for years stood exposed in the pitiless clarity of her arithmetic, with Vincent Gallo's name written at the center of it. She watched the smooth denials die in his throat as she produced document after document, each one anchoring the next, building a structure of proof that no clever tongue in that room could talk away, and she saw the faces of the old guard change from contempt to grim attention as they understood that this outsider they had dismissed was showing them a truth they had failed for years to see. Then she carried the proof across its final threshold, tracing the drained fortune into the failing accounts of the House of Belandi, laying bare the secret bankruptcy that the family had spent everything to conceal, and the room went very still as she demonstrated beyond argument that the theft and the marriage were two halves of a single design, that Vincent's fraud had been feeding the ruined Belandi house all along, that Vittoria's engagement to Dario had never been an alliance but a rescue, a scheme to bind a collapsing lineage to a river of Falcone money, and, together with the traitor within, to hollow out the empire from both sides and inherit what remained. Vittoria's composure shattered as the truth of her family's ruin was spoken aloud before the very people she had meant to deceive, and the arrogance she had worn so long curdled into something desperate and ugly, and for a moment she tried to protest, to spin the accusation into slander, but the evidence Wren had assembled left no room for performance, and the elders who had forced the engagement to protect the family now saw with cold fury that they had very nearly married their empire to its own destroyers. The engagement collapsed in that room, as surely as if it had never been, the alliance the old guard had schemed to build revealed as the trap it truly was, and Ignacio, who had set the whole marriage in motion out of his fear of the outsider, was left to reckon with the bitter truth that the real danger had never been the honest auditor at all, but the traitor and the bride he had trusted. And in the terrible clarity of that moment, something profound reversed itself, for the very quality that had cast both Wren and Dario out of their respective worlds, the refusal to look away from an unwelcome truth, the honesty that had made her unemployable and had once made him a traitor in the eyes of his own blood, was now the single force that had saved them both, exposing the conspiracy, breaking the trap, and vindicating the outcast before the assembled power that had scorned her. Wren stood in the center of that room, having done the one thing she had been punished her whole life for daring to do, and this time, the truth had not destroyed her, but delivered her, and as she looked across the room and met Dario's steel-gray eyes, she saw in them a recognition deeper than gratitude, the acknowledgement of a man watching another person wield the very weapon that had once been used to destroy him, and wield it, at last, to set things right. It was later, when the family had dispersed to deal with the wreckage of the conspiracy in their own ways, and the great house had fallen quiet, that Dario found Wren alone and asked her, for the first time without any calculation or command in his voice, whether she would sit and speak with him honestly, and she agreed, and the two of them, who had circled one another for weeks behind masks of suspicion and self-protection, finally set those masks aside. He began by confessing what she had long suspected and never quite been able to forgive, that he had read her notebook that first night in the clinic, that his eyes had caught the title and then moved down the page against every rule of decency, and that the raw, honest reasons she had written for refusing to disappear had reached something in him that nothing had touched in years, and he told her he was sorry for the intrusion, but that he could not bring himself to regret it, because those words had shown him who she was before she had spoken a single sentence aloud, and had changed everything he had intended to do. And then, haltingly at first and then with a steadiness that seemed to cost him a great deal, Dario told her the story he had never told anyone, of the young man he had once been, born into a family that lived in the shadows but still clung to some fragment of honor, of how he had discovered a betrayal at the very heart of that family, and had believed, in his youth and his foolish faith, that blood would stand with blood, and that speaking the truth before his own people would be honored, rather than punished. He told her how he had stood alone before the elders, and spoken that truth, and how the traitor he exposed had been more powerful and more cunning than he had understood, had already bought the loyalty of half the room, so that his truth had been twisted into an accusation against himself, and he had been branded the betrayer and cast down into the deepest ruin, while the real traitor prospered, and worst of all, how the vengeance had reached the one person who had believed him, so that he had lost not only his name and his place, but the father who had stood by him, all for the crime of refusing to look away. He had spent years clawing back from that abyss, he told her, and the man who finally climbed out was not the man who had fallen, for he had learned a lesson written in the hardest terms, that kinship meant nothing, and loyalty could not be assumed from shared blood, that the people closest to you were precisely the ones most able to destroy you, and he had built his empire on that cold knowledge and had trusted no one for so long that he had forgotten what trust even felt like. And this, he said, looking at her directly, was why he had done the thing that had bewildered his entire family, why he had brought an outsider into the heart of his affairs and given her access that no blood relative had ever been granted, because he had been betrayed twice now by his own household and had come to understand a paradox that the old guard could never accept, that an honest stranger who could not be bought was worth 1,000 times more than a trusted man who could, and that in a world where his own blood had proven treacherous, her incorruptible honesty was the only thing he had encountered in years that he could actually believe in. Wren listened to all of it and understood at last that the recognition she had felt pass between them on that late, quiet night had never been a manipulation after all, that they were in truth two people carrying the identical wound, each cast out for the same unforgivable courage, and that where she had clung to her honesty and paid for it with poverty, he had surrendered his and paid for it with his soul. And then Dario told her the thing that surprised her most of all, that watching her build her case with nothing but her own stubborn integrity, watching her break down the door, rather than wait for anyone to open it, had stirred something in him he had thought long dead, and that he had begun, for the first time in many years, to imagine walking a different path, to wonder whether a man who had built everything on blood and shadow might yet find a way to make his hands clean. And Wren saw in his weary steel-gray eyes not the crime lord all of Chicago feared, but the honest young man he had been before the world broke him, reaching, at last, toward the light. Some days after the reckoning, when the immediate storm had passed, and the family had begun the slow work of setting right what the traitors had nearly destroyed, Dario asked Wren to meet him not in any office or headquarters, but at the edge of Lake Michigan, and she came on a still gray afternoon when fresh snow lay soft over the shoreline and the vast water stretched away into a pale horizon, the wind quieter now than it had been on that first violent night, as though the whole city were holding its breath. They walked together along the frozen path with the lake at their side, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Two people who had spent their lives guarding every word, finding that in each other's presence, the silence itself felt honest. And it was Wren who broke it at last, telling him quietly that she owed him an apology, that on the night she learned what he was, she had accused him of using her, of turning her honesty and her desperation into a leash, and that while she still did not forgive the world he lived in, she understood now that she had misjudged the man, that he had never once treated her as the pawn she had believed herself to be. Dario shook his head slowly and told her she had nothing to apologize for, that her anger had been just, that any person who had been betrayed as often as she had would have been a fool to trust him, and that the suspicion which had wounded him was the very same instinct that had kept her alive, and there was no reproach in his voice, only the weary tenderness of a man who had learned the hard cost of every truth he now spoke. She asked him then what he would do, now that the conspiracy was broken and the path before him lay open, and he was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the frozen expanse of the lake, before he told her that he did not yet know, that a man could not simply wash away everything he had built and everything he had done, but that for the first time in longer than he could remember he wanted to try, that watching her had reminded him there was another way to live than the one that had hardened around him like a shell, and that whatever came next, he intended to begin the slow, difficult work of making his hands clean. They spoke then of the fathers they had both lost, of the particular loneliness of being the only one in a room willing to name a truth, of all the years each of them had spent believing that their wound was theirs alone to carry, and in the sharing of it something eased between them, not the sudden blaze of romance but something quieter and more durable, the recognition of two people who had each been broken in the same place, and had each, against all odds, refused to let the breaking make them into someone else. Wren felt it settle over her like the falling snow, gentle and unhurried, the dangerous, fragile beginning of something she had no name for and did not try to name, for she had learned to distrust hope and would not rush toward it now. And Dario, for his part, made no grand declaration and reached for nothing he had not been offered. The two of them simply standing side by side at the edge of the frozen lake, letting whatever was growing between them take root in its own time. And as the gray afternoon deepened toward evening, and the first lights of the city began to glow behind them across the snow, Wren understood that she had walked into this man's world as an outcast clutching the last shreds of her integrity, expecting to lose everything she had left, and had instead found the one thing that all her honesty had never once earned her in the ordinary world, which was to be truly seen and truly valued by another soul who carried the same wound she did. And though she could not know what the future would ask of either of them, she knew that the vast distance between the ruined auditor and the crime lord who was learning to become something more had finally, quietly, and completely closed. By the time Christmas came to Chicago, the whole city had wrapped itself in light, the historic brick streets glowing with countless threads of gold and white, wreaths on every door, and the crisp scent of pine and wood smoke drifting through the cold, clean air. And in a modest but warm apartment far from the shabby rooms where this story began, Wren Halloran stood at her window, watching the snow fall softly over a city that no longer felt like an enemy. Everything had changed in the months since that reckoning, for the truth she had built with her own hands had not only broken the conspiracy, but had transformed her own ruined life. And word of what the outcast auditor had accomplished had traveled quietly through the right circles, until doors that had slammed in her face 20 times over began, one by one, to open, and Wren, who had once scraped by on miserable temporary contracts, now found her rare gift sought after, and honored rather than feared, her honesty at last recognized as the treasure it had always been. She had used what she earned to give her grandmother the thing she had promised her through all those desperate years, a real home, warm and safe and secure, and on this Christmas evening the blind old woman sat contentedly by the decorated tree, while Dario, who had begun in earnest, the slow and difficult work of drawing his life out of the shadows toward something cleaner, listened to her stories with a patience that would have astonished anyone who had known only the crime lord all of Chicago once feared. And on the wall of that warm apartment there hung, side by side in two simple frames, the two documents that had bound these two wounded souls together from the very beginning. Her own worn leather notebook open to the page of reasons she had written in her darkest hour for why she would not disappear. And beside it, the fragile yellowed scrap of paper on which a young Dario had once scrawled his own vow never to vanish nameless into the ruin his family had cast him down into. Two testaments to the same stubborn refusal to surrender, framed together at last, as proof that the very honesty which had made them outcasts had also, in the end, been their salvation. Looking back across the strange and painful road that had begun with a woman fainting over a stack of ledgers on a snowbound night, Wren came to understand that the cruelest chapters of a life are so often the silent architects of its greatest strength, that when we are young and desperate, we read every rejection as a final verdict on our worth, and every closed door as the end of the road. And yet, as the years accumulate, and wisdom begins to soften our vision, we come to see that the most meaningful destinations are almost never reached by any straight and easy path. That the betrayals and the ruin, and the moments when we feel utterly abandoned in the dark, are frequently the very trials that refine us and prepare us for a truth we could not otherwise have borne. Had she never been rejected 20 times, had the world rewarded her honesty as it should have, she would never have taken that fateful contract, never crossed paths with the one man in the city who carried the identical wound and could recognize in her silent struggle a mirror of his own. And so she learned that our value is never truly dictated by the short-sighted judgment of those who close a door in our faces, that sometimes life requires us to reach the very bottom of our discouragement, not to break us, but to compel us to discover the fierce, untapped strength that lies waiting within our own souls. And that when we find the rare courage to break down a door with our own two hands, rather than wait for someone else to open it, we build a destiny that cannot be shaken, because it was forged in the fire of our own refusal to forget who we are, and no failure can ever truly define us, and no night is ever dark enough to hold back the dawn. If this story touched something in your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, and to like and share this video, so that you will never miss the many moving stories we bring you here each and every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please share your thoughts and your feelings in the comments below, because nothing means more to us than hearing the honest reflections that come from deep within the hearts of the people listening. Thank you so much for staying with Wren and Dario all the way to the end of their journey, and we wish every single one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, happy days ahead. Until next time, goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.